Decided to propose to my boyfriend, but first, I'm offering him the chance to pursue his dream of studying languages. I come from a fairly well-off family. It all started with my great-grandparents on my father's side, and since then, our family's wealth has only grown, exponentially, in fact. I won't deny that money has allowed me to enjoy life in ways most people never could, but it's also come with its own set of problems, especially when it comes to forming relationships, romantic or otherwise, outside of my family's usual social circles. Sadly, people have often changed around me the moment they found out about my finances, and not for the better. I've seen friendships fall apart in spectacular fashion just because I refused to pick up the bill for lunches that someone else invited me to. I've had romantic partners who turned into leeches, expecting endless gifts and money, some even making it an unspoken requirement for my affection. It's gotten ugly more than once, and if I hadn't had a few friends who stood by me, I honestly think I would have given up on people altogether. You might ask, why not date within your social circle? Oh, believe me, I tried. But so many of those people were self-centered, egotistical, even sociopathic, and it was such a turnoff. I mean, they managed to be even worse than the people who just wanted a free ride with my family's money. If that's not saying something, I don't know what is. When it comes to relationships, I've learned how crucial it is to be careful about when I reveal just how much money I have. It can't be too soon, but waiting too long can backfire too. Once, I told a boyfriend 9 months in, and he resented me for hiding it. Back then, I was still a little naive, so when problems started popping up, I tried to solve them by throwing money at them. It didn't work, obviously, and I ended up in tears. Another time, I revealed my finances after 3 months. For a while, it seemed fine. But then things changed. He became passive-aggressive, hinting around about how my money could fix whatever was lacking in his life. I mean, when your boyfriend keeps mentioning, again and again, how his PC is outdated or how his graphics card just died but he doesn't have the money to replace it. It was impossible to ignore. And the fact is, I would have bought him a top-of-the-line new PC in a heartbeat if he hadn't tried to guilt me into it. It wasn't about the money, it was about the way he behaved. I just couldn't do it. Sorry, I know I ramble when I'm nervous, and writing is no exception. But then Peter came along, and he was different from all the others. I waited 6 months into our relationship to tell him about my financial situation. Not because of some set timeline, but just because it felt right in my heart. We'd met 4 years ago at a hobby workshop, not exactly where I would have expected to find someone worth dating, but life is funny that way. After everything I'd been through, I'd become a bit of a cynic, so it took 5 months of friendly conversations with Peter before I admitted to myself that I wanted something more. My parents and siblings warned me yet again about dating below my status, but I tuned them out. I've learned people can be jerks no matter how much money they have. Peter is amazing. There's really no other word that fits. When I finally told him about my finances, he took it well. He understood completely why I'd been cautious about sharing that part of myself, and he made sure I knew he wasn't in this relationship for the money. That night, we just stayed in, cooked dinner together, and I don't think I'd ever felt so sure of a relationship in my life. Since we got together, money issues never came up. Not once. Peter never expected me to pay for everything or demanded lavish gifts. For our first anniversary, I made him a wood carving of his favorite book's cover, and he loved it. We both value gifts that come from the heart far more than anything you can just buy. Sure, he doesn't wood carve, but every gift he's given me, I treasure. The bottom line is, we're equals, money aside. I love him more than I ever thought possible, but the truth is, he works a regular job and he's not looking to make 6 figures or anything close to it. And that's absolutely fine by me. I have more than enough for both of us if we ever need it. Even my family eventually came around and grew to like him. I know they were only trying to protect me from getting hurt and used again, so I don't hold their early doubts against them. I do remember the prenup conversation, though. When my parents brought it up, only 2 years into our relationship, I was terrified Peter might just walk away. But he didn't. He sat down, talked rationally with them, and agreed that a prenup made sense for someone in my position. Now, we're at a point where I know I want to marry Peter. I want him as my husband, now and always. I even want his babies, the whole future. But more than anything right now, I want to do something special for him. Peter's always had this passion for learning foreign languages. He's got a real gift for it. He lights up when he can talk to someone in their native language or learn something new, even if it's just a few phrases. I want to make something clear. Peter has never, not once, brought up the idea of going to university or taking formal language courses since we've been together. He only ever mentioned, back when we were just casual friends, that he wished he could have studied a particular language at university, even before he knew anything about my family's money. Most impressive of all, Peter is self-taught. He's never had formal classes or anything. Every language he knows, even if a little clumsily at times, he's learned in his spare time, through the internet or by meeting and corresponding with people from abroad. I can't help but admire that determination and love for learning. Peter never went to university, not because he couldn't, but because he never wanted to burden his parents with scholarship fees. He told me himself, in his own honest words, he could never justify spending 4 years, or more, studying something that wouldn't guarantee a better job at the end of it. That university dream has always been a distant one for him, more of a hazy hope than something solid, and besides that one conversation 4 years ago, he's never brought it up again. I want to propose to him. I want to stand by his side for the rest of my life as his wife. I want Peter as my husband. I want the world to know that he's mine, and I'm his, forever. But before I do, I can't help but think about that shelved dream of his, the one he buried for the sake of practicality and for not wanting to weigh down his parents. I want to give him the chance to chase it, just once. Even if he says no to it, I want him to have that choice. I want to give him something that's just for him, something that could make him happy in a way he never allowed himself to be. Does any of this make sense? Sometimes, I wonder if I'm just being naive or if I'm overstepping my bounds. Is it too much to even consider postponing a wedding for 4 years? That sounds crazy, I know. University is no walk in the park, no matter how brilliant Peter is. I know studying is grueling, stressful, and can test even the strongest relationships. But my heart is set on this. I'm willing to ride out that storm if it means giving him a piece of the future he once wanted. Maybe I'm losing my mind for even considering something this unorthodox. Maybe there's a part of me that's just hoping I can make up for what he's given up. I just want to make the right choice. I want to see as many perspectives as possible, voices that aren't colored by friendship or family ties. Is it crazy to want to give him a shot at that dream before we step into marriage? And, I can't help but wonder, how would someone feel if the woman proposes? Would it make a difference? What would it mean for us, and for him? I just want to do what's right, for me, and for Peter. Update 1. Monday evening, it was just the two of us at my place, just like so many other nights when Peter slept over. But this night turned out to be anything but ordinary. I accidentally let my phone slip from my hand and dropped it on the floor, so I had a reason to get up from the couch. That's when I took the plunge. I got down on one knee, ring in hand, and proposed to Peter. At first, he just stared at me, completely struck speechless. Then, suddenly, he burst out laughing. I wasn't sure what to make of it. I was still kneeling there with the ring, feeling both hopeful and incredibly awkward. Without a word, Peter left the room, leaving me there, confused and still on one knee. But then he came back, and to my surprise, he got down on the floor with me, ring in his own hand, and asked me the same thing. We both just started laughing, unable to contain ourselves. When we tried to put the rings on each other's fingers at the same time, it turned into such a comedy of errors that I'm sure we looked absolutely ridiculous, but it only made things better. Later, Peter confessed he'd been carrying that ring for the past 5 months. He had originally planned to propose to me on New Year's Eve, but he didn't get the ring in time and decided to wait for the right moment, as if fate lined everything up for us to both end up proposing at the same time. The rest of the evening was just perfect. Sure, we ended up having to throw out the food left on the table the next morning, but nothing could have overshadowed how wonderful that night was. I waited until Wednesday for us to officially share the news with our families and close friends about our engagement. After all the excitement and celebrations, I decided to bring up my gift for Peter. We talked it through at length, considering everything carefully. It was a big thing for him to process, so he asked for a few days to think about it. I made sure he knew that I didn't care at all whether he decided to go for the degree or not. If he wanted, I could give him a full language course as an alternative, or we could even travel and stay abroad for several months so he could totally immerse himself and try something new. Last night, while we were spending time at his place, he gave me his answer. He was truly grateful for the effort and support I was willing to give to help him chase an old dream from his youth, but he realized that, deep down, it had always been more of a passing fancy than a true commitment. Even with all expenses covered, he didn't feel the pull to actually go back and study at university. One of his biggest concerns was that it would be tough on our relationship, and neither of us wanted that. Learning another language sounded intriguing, but not if it meant compromising what we had together or our future together. The idea of a language course was fun, and maybe even romantic in its own way, but in the end, he thought it would be far more exciting for us both to just take that extended trip abroad. In all honesty, I don't imagine we'll focus much on learning the language, and that's perfectly fine with me. So that's where everything stands. No 4 years of studying, no delays on the wedding. This winter, Peter will be my husband, and I'll be his wife. My heart is still soaring, and there's a part of me that can hardly believe all of this is real. I have never felt happier in my life. Update 2. Peter and I decided not to overthink the extended trip abroad part and just booked 2 round-trip tickets to a place where neither of us had any ties and the language would be a genuine unknown for both, Georgia, the country, because Peter once showed me a video of a traditional feast and whispered, "Imagine trying to give a toast in that language." It felt right to chase something that belonged to no past version of either of us. I can't pretend we planned much beyond that. We threw a few sweaters into carry-ons, asked our neighbor to water my plants, and told our families we'd be gone for about 2 weeks. I had this giddy, teenage runaway flutter in my chest I haven't felt since. Ever. On our second night in Tbilisi, we were swept into a Supra by a friend of a friend situation that felt suspiciously like fate disguised as hospitality. Peter's 5-phrase Georgian, acquired on the taxi ride from the airport, turned into 15 by the first round of toasts and 40 by the last. Numbers I'm making up, but that's genuinely what it felt like. The tamata, A stern grandfather with eyebrows like soft broom bristles made Peter stand and toast to the woman who chose you and whom you chose, and Peter did it. He did it. Not perfectly, he was stumbling, and he had to lean on English and pantomime, but his face when he looked at me. I could have cried into my cachapery and called it a perfect life. Someone behind me whispered, in that conspiratorial way that doesn't quite hide fondness, his tongue is not Georgian, but his heart speaks it. I know I'll be telling that line to our kids until they roll their eyes into the next room. And then, because apparently our lives decided to keep leaning into good chaos, we met Peter's pen pal. I didn't even know he had a pen pal. He'd never mention it because, in his words, it was just a quiet thing. They'd been exchanging messages for 3 years, little language challenges, recipes, local idioms no textbook would bother with. His name is Lasha, and he showed up with a bag of church kila and a taxi that had seen better days. He took us to his aunt's guest house in Salalaki, where breakfast included tomatoes that tasted like summer lived inside them and a radio that played old folk songs like the city was serenading us through the walls. It was Lasha's aunt who told us about the tiny church on a hill that gave blessings to engaged couples on Thursdays if they've been kind to each other that morning. It sounded like something out of the kind of story I roll my eyes at when my mother's friends tell them at luncheons, but there we were, hiking up steep, uneven steps between fig trees, my hands sticky from peeling fruit, Peter out of breath in that cute way he denies exists. The church was one room with soot-soft walls and a window that made the whole floor a bright square. An elderly caretaker, who I swear had been carved from olive wood, looked at our linked hands, nodded as if he'd been expecting us, and murmured a blessing I didn't understand but felt run through my bones. He tapped Peter's ring with a sprig of basil and told me, through Lasha, that husbands are like basil, if you pinch the tops, they grow better. I laughed. Peter said, very seriously, I was born to be basil. Back at the guest house, I had 3 missed calls from my mother. The subject line of her follow-up email made my stomach drop. Our family's lawyers had added clarifications to the prenup draft, and clarifications is one of those words that always means something will make me feel like I'm 16 again and in trouble for existing. In dry, immaculate language, they tried to tie my personal art, my messy, off-hour wood carvings and the stupid little foxes I whittle when I can't sleep, into the umbrella of my family's intellectual assets, as though my father's patents and my rough little animals belong in the same locked cabinet. It was such a small, surgical cut, so easy to shrug off as a detail, but it made me furious in a clean, cold way. Peter took my phone from me very gently, read everything twice, and said, we'll write our own lines first, and then we'll let lawyers translate our hearts into legal. He finds phrases like that without trying. I married a poet who refuses the title. We sat under a grapevine trellis with iced coffee sweating rings onto the table and sketched our version at the same time, speaking over each other and laughing and occasionally getting serious enough to stare at the page like it might blink back. We wrote that my family's money will never be the price of admittance for love. We wrote that my art is not an asset, it's a part of me, like my laugh and the freckle on my finger I hate. Peter asked for one clause, his own edition, which I didn't see coming. He wants a fund for future children's education set aside now, not from my family's trust, but from the money he has and what he will earn, because he doesn't want their learning to feel like a favor. He said, I want to be on the hook for their curiosity. I lost the ability to do anything besides kiss him until Lasha cleared his throat about 10 times in exaggerated succession. We found a local lawyer, recommended by Lasha's cousin, who set us down with lemon tea and explained that while she could not practice in our home country, she could point out where our language would turn into traps in translation. She circled 3 words and looked me in the eye in a way that reminded me of my grandmother when she's still, and said, don't let anyone tell you it's ugly to be clear. When we finally sent our version to my parents' legal team, Peter attached a polite note asking for their independent confirmation that any future family office decisions won't encroach on our household decisions. He's so impossibly kind that even his boundaries look like hand-carved signs instead of barbed wire. It worked. By morning, their clarifications were gone, and a different partner replied with something I never expected, understood. In between all this, life kept being stubbornly alive around us. Peter met a bookseller with ink-stained fingers who needed help translating a letter from a customer in Poland. Peter's Polish is marginal at best, but he pieced it together with a grin that you could practically hear. The man wouldn't take money, but he would take a story, so Peter told him about learning his first foreign words from the labels on imported chocolate in our local international shop, sounding them out like spells. The bookseller listened like it was a prayer. He disappeared into the back and re-emerged with a precariously wrapped package. Inside was a worn copy of the very book whose cover I carved for Peter years ago. The same edition, the same etching on the title page, only in Georgian. For the girl who carves answers into wood, the man said to me, in halting English. I'm not a crier, I was a fountain. On our last day, rain came down like the sky had been holding back for weeks. We ducked into a small cafe, and a woman at the next table was arguing with someone on speakerphone in French. Without thinking, Peter leaned over and asked, in French, if she would like him to explain in calmer terms to the person on the other end that the paperwork could be resubmitted with a signature on a separate page. She blinked, handed him the phone, and 10 minutes later he had diffused a bureaucratic storm that doesn't even exist in our country. She turned out to be an editor for a tiny multilingual journal that publishes essays about learning and the places that teach you. Peter now has an invitation to write something about teaching himself languages without losing his joy. He keeps pretending he's not giddy about it. He is giddy about it. He slept with his head in my lap on the flight home and muttered verbs in his dreams. The most unexpected part of all of this happened the day after we landed. My grandmother, my father's mother, who is composed largely of sharp wit, red lipstick, and rules she breaks only when no one is looking, had a minor stroke. The doctors were optimistic, but the world moves differently when someone you love is sitting still in a hospital bed with half her smile working a little harder than the other half. She asked to see us, and when we walked in, she pointed at the rings, then at the ceiling, and made a face like, well? I heard myself say, we can do the legal ceremony now, with you. It spilled out of me like something that had been waiting on the tip of my tongue since that Basil Sprigg kissed Peter's ring. We got married that afternoon in the hospital's tiny chapel. A chaplain with kind eyes and hands that knew how to stay out of photographs stood with us. My grandmother held the pen to sign as a witness and said, slantwise, if anyone asks, I wrote poetry instead, which is her way of refusing to say she struggled. I wore a dress that wasn't the dress, Peter wore the shirt he proposed in, and we promised the same things we'd scribbled under the grapevine, translated not into legal or Georgian or anything but the language we've always used, which is simply, try, always try, and pinch the basil kindly. It wasn't a winter wedding with everything planned down to the napkins. That will still happen, and we'll dance till our knees beg for mercy. But this was ours in a way nothing staged could be. The nurse cried. Even the chaplain looked a little glassy-eyed. My grandmother pressed our hands together like she could make us permanent by pressure alone and whispered, now go be happy, and don't let them make it complicated. We walked out into late afternoon, paper white clouds blowing themselves into new shapes, and the world felt differently tilted, not because of the money or the trip or the paperwork, but because we had made something that existed only because we both said yes to it, over and over, in small ways and then loudly. I know it's all very ordinary when you strip it down, 2 people, 2 rings, 2 signatures, but somewhere between the toast I didn't understand and the blessing I felt to my bones and my grandmother's name scrawled sharp as ever, our life shifted into focus. And I realized, with a certainty that made me laugh out loud in the hospital parking lot, I am the luckiest woman alive to have found someone who will answer in any language as long as the question is love. Update 3. The morning after the chapel, my father called at 7:13 with the kind of careful calm that meant someone had already yelled in a conference room. He congratulated us, which landed like a formal napkin placed just so on a table, and then cleared his throat and asked, lightly, if we had executed the paperwork. I said no. There was a silence with a heartbeat in it, and then 3 new emails appeared like thunder. The family office froze, nothing dramatic, just the automatic transfers that tidy my life behind the scenes, under the heading prudence, which is cousin to clarifications and makes my spine itch the same way. Peter was tying his shoes for a run when I told him. He sat down, untied them, and said, okay. We'll do a postnup. Like he was naming a bird. It is remarkable how fast a word you've never needed can become furniture in your mouth. We found a lawyer who did not know my parents except as footnotes in the business section and who wore mismatched socks that made me trust him immediately. He read our grapevine vows like they were a draft poem and said, in the gentlest legalese, that they were beautiful and useless if we didn't translate them properly. We did the translation together at his kitchen table while his cat judged our commas. Peter kept the clause about our future children's education exactly as he'd written it, on the hook for their curiosity, and when the lawyer asked if he wanted to soften that language, Peter said, no. Hooks aren't always sharp, sometimes they hold you up. We walked out with a postnuptial agreement that read like the plainest truth we could make, what's me is me, what's us is us, and no one outside gets to rename our edges. My mother came over with a cake and an apology and the kind of hug that starts a decade late. My father sent me a short text that said, understood, which in his vocabulary is not small at all. By the end of the week, the prudence disappeared from my accounts like a tide going out, and an email arrived from the partner who had undone the earlier clarifications. It contained one sentence, thank you for insisting on clarity. He didn't need to add anything, and he didn't. My grandmother kept her lipstick rules in a neat little stack on the bedside table and her stubbornness in her posture. Physical therapy turned her into a metronome of will, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, a joke every other beat. On the 3rd day, she asked Peter to bring her the hat box at the top of her wardrobe. He came back dusted with a little history. Inside were letters tied with 2 different ribbons, red and blue, and a photograph of a girl with my grandmother's jawline and a haircut like a dare. The red ribbon was Paris, the blue Warsaw. I had pen pals, she said, sly as a card shark. The world was wider than the train schedule. She was 17 in the photograph and furious about everything, which made Peter grin. She couldn't read for long without her eyes stinging, so Peter read to her in the afternoons, slipping between French and Polish and English like a magician palming coins. The letters were wonderfully ordinary, homework complaints, recipes, a description of a spring coat admired in a window, outrage at a teacher's favorite student, that kind of thing, until they weren't. One from Paris, dated May 1968, was a riot in the shape of a paragraph. One from Warsaw, in careful, shaking handwriting, mentioned a brother who didn't come home. My grandmother was quiet after we finished that one. I was a coward, she said finally. I stopped writing when I fell in love with your grandfather, because I thought it was disloyal to keep the versions of me they knew. She looked at me the way she looks when she's measuring fabric. Would you find them? The addresses were obsolete, of course, but the names were not. We started with the French editor from the cafe, because the universe had already wrapped a thread around her finger in ours. She sent 2 emails that turned out to be keys. Within 3 days, a granddaughter in Lyon responded with a photograph of a kitchen where the wallpaper and the laughter were the same age. Her grandmother, Colette, was alive and wore rouge like a flag. We set up a video call. My grandmother positioned the laptop so that only her good side showed, rolled her eyes at me when I laughed, and when Colette's face popped onto the screen, 80 years shrugged off like a shawl. They shouted over each other, cried, and then immediately began arguing about the right way to make vinaigrette. The granddaughter and I sat back and played translators when necessary and audience when it was not. At the end, Colette leaned into her camera and said, in French, "I kept your last letter in the flour tin because no one would ever look there," and my grandmother flashed the photograph of her 17-year-old self like a trump card. The Warsaw Trail will be harder. The granddaughter of the letter writer moved to Chicago, the email said, and the blue ribbon is knotted in 3 places, but Peter is good with knots. In the middle of all this, Peter's essay came out in the tiny journal that is a home built out of sentences. He agonized over commas for exactly 3 days, then hit send and immediately went for a walk like he'd thrown a message into the sea. He wrote about learning to say thank you in 8 languages before he learned to ask for help in 1, about how the first new words he memorized were not in textbooks but on candy wrappers and shampoo bottles, and about how a toast in a language he barely knew cracked something kind open in him. It wasn't earth-shattering. It was better. People wrote him emails that felt like cousins. A community center 2 neighborhoods away asked if he'd run a Saturday workshop for adults labeled hopeless with languages. He laughed and said yes, and called it labels, letters, and toasts. The first session, I sat in the back and watched a room full of people teach each other words for bread and mother and home. A woman in her 60s cried when she managed the roller in Pero, then laughed at herself and rolled it again just to prove it wasn't a fluke. Peter came home floaty and exhausted, the best kind of tired. We had coffee with his boss the next week because he wanted to request a small change in his hours to make the Saturday sessions easier. I braced automatically, the stupid old reflex like a muscle memory, for some comment about how he didn't need to work as much now, as if my bank balance were a pie cooling on a windowsill, but it never came. His boss said, if you're starting something that lights you up, we'll find a way to keep you here and let you do that, and then offered him a flexible schedule that made me want to send the man a thank you plant. Basil, obviously. Wedding things started growing like vines without becoming snares. We're keeping our big celebration in winter, but it already feels less like a performance and more like an echo of the day in the chapel. My grandmother insists on making place cards in her looping hand once her grip allows it. Lash's aunt is sending dried basil tied with thin gold thread for the tables, and the bookseller from Tbilisi mailed us an old postcard with a black and white photograph of a Supra and a note, "Practice your toasts, the tomata is anyone who loves truth." I started carving little wooden basil leaves when I can't sleep, because apparently I am consistent even when I think I'm not. Some nights, Peter reads drafts of toasts in quiet Georgian and I repeat after him, and we laugh when my mouth trips. He tells me my tongue is stubborn and brave. I tell him he married both on purpose. We signed the postnup on a Wednesday because Wednesdays have always been the day when nothing dramatic is supposed to happen, and then went to the hospital to show my grandmother her name in the witness line on our chapel papers. She tapped it with one fingernail and said, "Permanent," which sounded better coming from her than it ever has from anyone in a suit. On the way out, Peter stopped to ask the nurse who cried at our ceremony how her brother's college applications were going. She hugged him in a way that would have been unprofessional if it hadn't been so human. Later, when we got home, the cat from our lawyer's house had left fur on our postnup where we'd put it down to take off our coats. We both laughed. We left it there for a while, like a blessing. I know the story could be told in simpler beats. We married, we signed, we planned. But that leaves out the part where a 17-year-old girl in a faded photograph met the woman she became on a screen and forgave her for choosing new versions of love. It leaves out the room where grown adults learned how to roll a letter in their mouths and felt something shake loose in their chests. It leaves out the fact that a word like postnup can sound like a choke and then turn into a promise if you say it next to someone who insists on being kind in the clauses. The short answer is that we are fine, more than fine. The longer answer is that life has chosen to keep us busy with the precise kinds of busy that make me feel wide awake. Some nights, when the apartment is small with quiet and the basil we brought home from the market leans toward the window like it's rehearsing something, Peter will look up from his notes and say, very seriously, "Pinch me," and I do, just at the tops, and we both grow. Update 4. The Warsaw thread tugged itself into a knot and then handed us the end. At 2 a.m, my phone lit the dark with an email titled Niebieska Wstazka. There was a photograph of a flour tin with a dent like a dimple and, around it, a blue ribbon I would have recognized anywhere from my grandmother's hatbox. The message was from a woman named Anya in Chicago. Her grandmother had passed years ago, but the letters were in the back room of their family bakery, tucked behind sacks of sugar as if sweetness could protect them. "We bake in Polish," she wrote. "Come before the morning rush. The ribbon has been waiting. 2 days later we were under an L track with the train shouting overhead like a punctuation mark. The wind there speaks an alphabet all its own. Peter tried to answer it with Dzień dobry and Dziękuję, his nose pretending to be Polish for a block and a half before it defected back to English. The bakery smelled like forgiveness, yeast and butter and something that had been rising since 1952. Anya had her grandmother's cheekbones and a flower handprint on her hip. She hugged us the way family does even when you've just met them. She led us past shelves of poppy seed rolls and jam thumbprints into a small office where the wallpaper had lost track of its own flowers, and set the blue ribbon on the desk like an altar. The letters were a landscape. The handwriting began stubborn and straight and softened as it aged. The first said, in French so careful it might have been walking on ice, "My teacher says my French is a hammer. Your French is a spoon. Both will eat soup." Another, years later, in Polish with a line or two in English as a courtesy to future finders, told about a coat sewn from 3 other coats and a boy who wrote his name on the inside. There were recipes half invented and radiantly wrong notes about American movies and one small pressed cornflour that survived 3 moves, 4 winters, and hands not afraid to pinch where necessary. Peter read aloud in a patchwork of languages stitched with Google sweater logic and the kind corrections of a woman in the front of the shop who introduced herself as Pani Christina and refused to sit until we brought her a chair. She kept clicking her tongue at his soft consonants and then grinning when he caught one cleanly. "Dobry chłopik," she said finally, patting his cheek like a blessing. "Good boy." I took a photograph of her hand on his face and decided I would frame it for the kitchen. There was an unsent letter near the bottom, folded like worry. It was addressed to my grandmother by the girl's full name and the old street that doesn't exist anymore. It began with an apology and ended with a recipe for makowiak and a sentence that felt like the point of a pin. "I did not stop loving the world when I fell in love, I only rearranged where the love went." Peter's voice wobbled. Anya dabbed her eyes with a napkin meant to live a simpler life as a crumb catcher. We called my grandmother from the back room. She positioned the phone to catch her good side without being told. When Peter read the pinned sentence, she closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, she wasn't 17 or 80, she was some precise age that exists only between the two. "She always knew how to put a knife into butter," she said, and breathed out an old laugh. Later she asked for the makowiak recipe twice and told me to put it where I keep passwords. We stayed long enough for the morning rush to turn into a small parade. Peter translated for a man ordering a cake for a niece's citizenship ceremony, and then, because apparently Joy likes to fool around with our calendar, someone from the public library who had read his essay recognized his voice and asked, apologizing 3 times and offering a bag of Paxki as bribery, if he would come that afternoon to talk for half an hour about learning to speak without being ashamed of your accent. He said yes before the sentence had a period. The manager of the community room handed him an old microphone that sighed when it woke up. People came with words they were afraid of and words they loved. A teenager said Zalo and laughed like she had just ridden a roller coaster. An old man rolled the R in Jekka so hard he almost fell over and then saluted his own absurdity. Peter told them about the toast in Georgia and the way it split something bright in him. He taught them Nozdrowie, and my father, who had flown in on a morning plane just to see what this Chicago business is about, walked into the back of the room while Peter was reading the makowiak line and stood there very still, as if movement would scare it away. After, he shook Peter's hand like he meant it and asked, so serious he could have been asking about quarterly results, "How do I say it properly?" He practiced Nozdrowie until he earned it. We packed the letters with the same reverence I have for heavy jewelry that belonged to women who knew what they were doing. Anya wrapped the blue ribbon around my wrist for a minute, just to feel it there, and then tied it back around its old work like a promise. We left the bakery with flour on our clothes and poppy seeds in our teeth and a sticky note with Pani Christina's phone number because you will mispronounce something again and need me. On the flight home, my coffee tasted like the inside of a metal spoon. I blamed airplane logic and then blamed Lake Michigan and then the fact that I'd eaten my weight in sugar. Back in our kitchen, I made a face at my mug so exaggerated that Peter laughed and said, "You look like the tomato when someone tries to toast honesty with a half-truth." The next morning, the basil by the window smelled like a forest and then like a challenge. I put the kettle on, took it off, and stood in the doorway of the bathroom with a small stick in my hand like it was a delicate tool carved for a single job. I felt at once too big and too small to contain what the second pink line meant. I walked into the living room and set the stick down next to the little wooden basil leaves I've been carving at night without thinking, as if my hands knew to make themselves busy. Peter looked up from editing a short piece the journal asked him to cut by a few sentences, saw the color where there hadn't been color before, and didn't speak for a heartbeat that could have been a paragraph. Then he got the exact look he had in the one-room church with the basil sprig, as if the world had made a square of light on the floor just for us. He whispered, "Po Polsku?" And I tried. "Yes dem wchazy." My mouth tripped, my tongue did its stubborn brave thing, and he understood anyway, which is our entire story. We told my grandmother with makowiak cooling on her tray table. She pretended to scold me for leaping before braiding my hair or eating enough spinach, then cried in a way that made her lipstick misbehave. "Put the blue ribbon in the baby's book," she said, already assigning it a place in a future cupboard. "And if anyone tells you it's too much to be straightforward about joy, tell them it is ugly not to be." Life shifted itself again like a chair pulled closer to a table. Peter's Saturday workshop sprouted a second class for people teaching their parents how to say their grandchildren's names. He came home with stories that made us both want to lie flat on the rug and stare at the ceiling out of sheer gratitude. A man who rolled in our the way his father used to roll cigarettes. A woman who learned to say grandmother in the language her own was punished for speaking in school, and then said it into the corner like a prayer where no one would hear and the air would tell that woman anyway. We drove out to my father's house for dinner the next week, the one that sits like a thesis on a lawn that looks like it was ironed. My mother pressed both our faces into her hands the way she did when I was little and I'd done something brave on the playground. My father had practiced his Polish toast enough that it came out sounding like respect. He asked Peter what he needed from him, and Peter said, without flinch or flourish, only this: do not measure our family by balance sheets or translate it into percentages. Measure it in languages learned to love each other better. My father is allergic to sentiment without structure. You could see him trying to give it a column and failing and choosing, just this once, to let it stand like a sculpture that holds itself up. The last of the legal paperwork came back stamped and tidy in hours. The partner who likes single sentences sent another, permanent. My grandmother beeped at her monitors until a nurse came in and then ordered the nurse to sit while she wrote the place cards for our winter celebration in slow, defiant loops. She made one extra and wrote, in faint pencil, and guessed, then looked at me like a conspirator. I kissed her on the cheek and stole one of her hospital grapes, and she swatted at me without heat. Sometimes, late now, the basil leans toward the glass and the wind outside smudges the city into a lullaby, and Peter practices a toast in a language that isn't ours and then in one that is, and I imagine a small person hearing all these sounds and choosing one to say first. Maybe it will be a word we don't expect. Maybe it will be nothing at all for a while and then everything all at once. For now, it is a shape in the air we both recognize when we speak into it, and it answers us back without words.